All right, good afternoon and welcome. This is the California State Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3 on Resources and Transportation. My name is Richard Gordon, member of the California State Assembly and chair of the Budget Subcommittee. Joining me today at this meeting is Assemblymember David Valadeo, who is also a member of our subcommittee, and Assemblymember Jerry Hill, who we've asked to join us here at the dais. Let me first provide a kind of a schedule and program so folks know what the plan is for this afternoon. We will begin with a presentation from the High-Speed Rail Authority on the business plan that has been prepared. We have allotted 30 minutes for that presentation. Following that, we will have 8 different speakers. A couple are listed under response panel, a couple under comment panel. Each of those 8 speakers has been allotted 5 minutes each. Following that, we will open it up for public comment. And if members of the public would like to address the subcommittee, there is a speaker's slip, a form that you'll need to fill out at the back desk. Those will be brought to me, and I will, once I see how many speakers we have, make a ruling from the chair here as to how much time will be allotted. I want to try to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak who wants to, but we do only have this room until 5 o'clock. We have to adjourn at that point, so I will adjust the time to make sure that we can get everybody in. I want to first thank the City of Palo Alto for providing this space for this hearing, and the Mayor of Palo Alto, Sid Espinosa, is here, and Sid specifically wanted to thank you. I would also note that this hearing is being broadcast via the internet and is being recorded for the record of the State Assembly. With that, let me start by saying that today we take an important first step in what will eventually lead to some key decisions that we made on the future of high-speed rail for California. There will be other hearings. This is not the last, but it is the first. And there will be a process over the next several months as the California legislature, working with the High-Speed Rail Authority and with the administration, begins to determine what course we will take as we move forward. Today is an opportunity for the authority to, in this venue, present issues related to the business plan for key members of the public to respond and to provide information. There will be no decisions made today. There will be eventually a decision reached, but we're several months away from that. Today is the start of a process of providing information, gathering data, and developing levels of understanding. That part of the process is ultimately necessary if we are to make good decisions for the future of California. This is, as proposed, probably the largest public works project that would occur in the state of California, certainly in our lifetime, if not in many generations. And so decisions need to be carefully considered and carefully weighed, and that's why we begin this process here today. I want to extend an opportunity to my colleagues who are here from the Assembly if they would like to make some opening remarks before we go to our first panel. So, David.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate the opportunity to come up here. I represent Kings County, Kern County, Fresno County, and Tulare County, all of Kings and a portion of the other 3. This has been a big issue for us down in my area. Some of you have heard of Kings County probably lately. They've been making a lot of noise. I've held a couple little hearings in my district, and there's been a great response. We've had a couple hundred, 300, and even as many as 400 people show up to some of these, both speak in opposition and support. And this is a very important part of the process, getting to hear what locals have to say about this, especially with the size of this project, the amount of jobs at stake here, and with what's going on in the budget at the Sacramento right now. So excited to be here. Curious to see what we're going to learn and hear from the locals. And thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for showing up and being part of the process.
Assemblyman Hill.
Thank you, Rich. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I thank you for bringing the hearing to the peninsula and to Palo Alto. And thank you to the mayors at Espinosa and to Palo Alto for allowing us to be here today. This is a kind of a crucial time, obviously, for high-speed rail. And David, you think those couple hundred people that are active in the valley or something, you ain't seen nothing yet when you come to the peninsula on a topic like high-speed rail. We are concerned, and I think this is a great opportunity for us today to get some briefing on the business plan that was released a week or so ago, and I think it'll be a good chance for us to kind of get into the weeds a little bit and get down into what the details are and the cost of this. So I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you, Rich, for holding it here.
All right, thank you. With that, we'll move to the presentation of the business plan by the California High-Speed Rail Authority. And let me introduce Jim Hartnett, board member of the authority. Jim, welcome, and I'll allow you to take the lead. I understand that there are several new appointees to the board, and even though you're relatively new, amongst those who are present today, you have seniority.
What a surprise. Yes.
So I call on you to introduce your colleagues and to introduce the Chief Executive Officer and get us started.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Assembly members, for being here and for giving us this opportunity to speak with you and to hear people's comments today. I'm going to introduce each of the presenters briefly. And then I'll have some remarks when they conclude. I think you have met our CEO previously, Roelof van Ark. What people often don't recall about him is that he's spent a career in the transportation business, focusing on rail, including high-speed rail. He's been the president and CEO or president in title of several companies that have international reach. He's been involved around the world in turnkey transportation projects. He has been involved in public-private partnerships in terms of transportation systems. He's an expert on high-speed rail and on transportation and on rail. So we're very lucky to have him as the CEO of the High-Speed Rail Authority. He's going to open with a few remarks about the business plan. Then I will call upon Dan Richard. Dan is a person known to many of you as well from his extensive public service as a member of the BART board, served a long tenure in BART with great distinction. He is an appointee of Governor Brown to the High-Speed Rail Authority Board. He goes back a long time with the governor, having served in Governor Brown's first administration when I was just 6, I think. No, I remember the administration well. Dan has brought tremendous expertise to this high-speed rail endeavor, tremendous commitment, and a fresh set of eyes to the board, as has Mike Rossi, who's sitting immediately to my left, who many of you know as a person who spent a career in finance and banking at very high level in terms of sophisticated projects. He has brought tremendous expertise to this authority. He and his view of his duties as a board member often talks about his fiduciary duty to the citizens of the state of California, and for just calling it as he sees it. He and Dan have taken the models apart that were used for our high-speed rail authority and analyzed them, checked them, and put them back together and to really test out whether or not the data that is in the business plan that's before you, which is a draft business plan, and subject to change based upon comments that we receive, is one that provides reasonable information and is a decision-making tool for those who will be making decisions separate and apart from the High-Speed Rail Authority Board. So with that, I will conclude with some comments on the blended approach, and Roloff will lead off with some remarks on the business plan.
Thank you, Jim. Chairman, Assembly members, thank you for having us here this afternoon. And yes, I would like to just speak on two aspects really of the business plan today. Firstly, how we put the business plan together. And secondly, to bring some clarity on some kind of areas of, I think, miscommunication, particularly related to high-speed rail around the world and high-speed rail in California. So firstly, how we put this business plan together. We worked about 6 or 7 months putting this together as a team. You requested transparency, you requested the truth. I believe this business plan is based on a fair and reasonable and possibly somewhat conservative assumptions and figures. But I felt strongly that that is what we needed. We needed to know what the truth was, and that is what you have received in the business plan. Please consider that we here in the United States, and this is maybe one of my big shockers, do not have a lot of experts, and I mean that as the population. The population of the United States do not have a lot of experts in rail, high-speed rail. That expertise is very, very limited. Many are quick to comment, but they lack the understanding of how high-speed rail actually works, and for that reason, to some extent, the business case of the High-Speed Rail Authority, how it works, how it should be built, and how it should be funded. We have used high-speed rail experts throughout the process of putting this high-speed rail business plan together. I've ensured that we used some of the best high-speed rail competencies available in the United States, and in fact, through some of our consultants, Parsons Brinckerhoff and KPMG, we have experts in our team that built and were involved in the UK, in Holland, in Spain, in Taiwan, in China, and some of these candidates, and in France, and some of these candidates worked in those projects for 10 to 15 years and actually built those projects. So these people really understand what high-speed rail is about, apart from my humble knowledge of high-speed rail that I gathered over the years where I have been working and also been in charge of high-speed rail projects. We've made full use of our international cooperation agreements. We have 9 such agreements with all the countries in the world that operate high-speed rail systems: Belgium, China, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, South Korea, and the UK. In fact, when I came on board just nearly a year and a half ago, I made sure that we made extensive use of those resources and ensured that we kept contact with those authorities through the embassies and consulates. These people understand the real benefits of high-speed rail, and just as a matter of information for the public as well, in just the last 3 years, between 2008 and 2011, the operational fleet of high-speed rail trains in the world grew by 45%, from 1,737 trains to 2,517 trains. So this is a fast expanding market in the world because of its need and attractiveness. So I would now just like to spend a few minutes on bringing some clarity on some issues that really are misinformation, and they are constantly being used, and we read and hear about them over and over again. The first is the statement that all high-speed rail systems in the world operate at a profit. Let us not continue to argue this issue. The UIC, or the International Union of Railroads, has very clearly confirmed this. Many operators of high-speed rail in the world are private companies or even listed companies. And you can see them, they make profits. They are private listed companies, like in Japan, they're listed. They're private companies in many parts of the world too. And as operators of either the rolling stock, the actual operations, or even operators of the infrastructure, the infrastructure operators as well. High-speed rail is a very interesting investment possibility around the world, clearly needing public investment to start them and to invest and pay for a lot of the infrastructure. But generating cash as far as operating profits are concerned. This is a report, it's actually part of the business plan from the UIC, which also specifies and clears that situation, that high-speed rail is profitable everywhere in the world. By the way, just a statement that includes even Taiwan. And personally, I was involved in the Taiwan project. But even in Taiwan, from year one, Taiwan generated an operating profit. Taiwan, the private investors in Taiwan, took on a huge amount of the complete project debt. And they were not, for a while, able to service that debt. But in the meanwhile, they're even servicing the debt of that infrastructure funding that they're doing as well. The second point is, let us not always compare California high-speed rail to the Northeast Corridor Acela Express system. There is no comparison. The Amtrak Acela system is not typically a high-speed rail system. It shares the nation's most congested rail corridor. It operates on an average at 60 to 80 miles per hour, compared to the average of 140 to 160 miles an hour that we would be operating, which is more than double the speed of the Acela Express. And they are limited to 20 trains. Thus, they were not able to offer either the times, travel times, nor the train frequencies that you require to create highly competitive downtown to downtown services, especially as an alternate to air transportation. It is for this reason that Amtrak would like to invest another $117 billion in 2010 dollars, which, if you expand that, it's $200 billion in year of expenditure, to upgrade its 426 miles of alignment over the next 30 years. And that is an upgrade, that is not a new build. However, let us not understate their success. Even with this very low 3 million ridership that they have in the Acela Express per annum, limited by the restrictions I've just mentioned to you, they too operate at an operating profit. The Acela Express cost recovery ratio for the fiscal year 2010 was 142%. That means they made 42% more revenue than their costs. And in the first 8 months of 2011, they run at 156%, so 56% higher than the costs that they generate. Thereby, they subsidize many of the other loss-making sections within the country. I would also like to say that there are some statements that are being made about ridership, and I know that Mike Rossi is going to talk a lot more about ridership, and the possibility or impossibility of having ridership numbers that equate to the population of the corridors. This is very common. In fact, the figures that we have in California are low compared to the ratio of population to ridership that is seen in other corridors in the world, where these ratios are much higher. I'd like to then say one or two words on phased implementation. You will notice that one of the main things that we have described in our business plan is the aspect of phased implementation, as well as the concept of working towards initial operating section. And this is the way to go. In fact, so is the way with the blended system, which will be discussed by Jim later on again. Blended system being for the bookends or the ends of the line. This is the way the experts in the rest of the world have implemented most of the high-speed rail systems in other countries. The line from Paris to Lyon is 270 miles. And by the way, Lyon is a little city. It was a city of 800,000 people. While the line from Madrid to Seville, Madrid is a city of about 4 million, Seville is a city of 1 million, and the distance between the two is 490 miles, Seville being a small coastal town of 1 million people. Those two lines were the IOSs, the initial operating sections, for Spain and France. They led to the most well-known TGV system in France, which grew out of that first 290 miles, and today the whole country is netted together with high-speed rail, and they continue in the way of PPPs to expand their network in the country. The same with Spain. After having built Madrid, Seville, they expanded the rest of the country and is now the biggest system in Europe. The decision for the Central Valley, that was the right decision to build a high-speed rail, to start the construction, not as a standalone high-speed rail line, no, but to start the construction to work towards the IOS, or the initial operating section. It's also the place where we will have the ability to test at up to 250 miles an hour the first trains ever to be built in the United States of America, the first power systems to be built in the United States of America, the first signaling, control, and rail systems to be built to operate at 220 miles an hour, to be tested at 250 miles an hour. Every country needs to have a system like that, a place like that to test. And the Central Valley offers that to us. It's the only place in our alignment that will offer us that facility too. One more statement before I hand on to my board members, and that is the right time to bring on private investors. Again, I can tell you from the projects I have worked on around the world, and in particular the high-speed rail projects around the world, where a lot of PPP, as we call it, or public-private partnership, is common and normal. It is a matter of looking at them closely. The models used in Japan and the UK were different to the models used in, say, Spain or France. But they all started with a public investment that started these projects, and then as one gets closer to a revenue-generating stream, that is when you bring on the private sector. We have done that in our business plan. It is comparative with the systems around the world. And there is, for a system as huge as a Californian high-speed rail system, and this being the first in our country, there is no shortcut to the solution. This is the way these projects are built around the world, and this is the way they are funded around the world. So with that introduction on why and how we got to these particular aspects of the business plan, I want to hand on to the two board members. And in particular, I'd like to say how pleased I was, because as much as I had a good team of international experts and local people putting together the plan, it was very encouraging to have very aggressive board members who came in and reviewed this plan. And I am really encouraged by the fact that we have this board and these members that have spent so much time to go in depth into our business plan, and to, it was really, really a deep dive. And I'm glad they're here today to explain to you what they found and how they see the business plan. And I think that's the best testament that you'll get to our business plan today. So with that, I would like to hand over to Dan Richard.
Mr. Richard, as you begin, I'm going to be a real stickler on time today, so we can get everybody have an opportunity. Just to let you know, you've got 15 minutes left for this presentation.
So that gives me 13 and Rossi 2 then, as that, I understand.
That's what happens when you're the youngest.
It does sound like one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My watch just stopped, but I have a view of the clock there, so we'll respect that. Mr. Chairman and members, thank you very much for this opportunity. I I am Dan Richard, member of the High Speed Rail Authority. And let me just quickly jump to a number of points that I wanted to make about the plan itself and what it represents. First of all, I think it's very important that we emphasize to you that this plan represents a significant departure for the High Speed Rail Authority. And it's a departure in several different ways. First of all, I think there's been a fundamental philosophical shift away from the notion that high-speed rail in California was going to be a separate, standalone system, more or less imposed on the map of the state without regard or much regard to how it interacted with the existing systems that we have in California. And we actually have a successful and growing network of rail systems, not just systems like BART, Caltrain, the ACE train, and so forth, Capital Corridor. But this business plan builds on a philosophy that high-speed rail must be integrated into the rail network that we have to leverage off of not just the assets, but the expertise and experience of our existing rail operators. And that's, of course, very important here on the peninsula. My colleague Jim Hartnett is going to go into detail about that. The second thing is that, as Roelof van Ark said, we are very committed in this business plan draft document to provide you with real numbers. Real numbers about the capital cost, real numbers about the operating costs, to the best of our ability, real numbers about the ridership and other aspects of this, so that you as policymakers can make the appropriate decisions going forward. And I want to point out that part of that, to our detriment in the public relations sphere, is that we present numbers to you both in terms of 2010 constant dollars, which allows you to compare this business plan draft with earlier business plans, but also to look at what the true cost is going to be over the next generation of building this. And that means using inflated dollars, and that's where the very high numbers come from, because we talk about construction that's going to occur far into the future. And let me say on that, Roelof used the term conservative. My colleague Mike Rossi likes to use the term reasonable assumptions, but our inflation rate, just to give you one example, of 3% a year is significantly higher than our recent experience and probably what will be the experience the next few years. If you use the last 3 years' inflation rate for the next 3 years and then jumped to 3% after that, immediately $5 billion would come off the cost. So the inflationary effects are very significant here, but again, as you make your decisions, we wanted to let you see those numbers as they will play out over time for the cost of the system. The key element of the business plan is this notion of a phased approach of the high-speed rail system construction. Recently I had a chance to meet with the representatives of Japan, both the government and also Japan Rail, the private operator of the Japanese system. And what I hadn't really fully appreciated was that they opened their first line in 1964 in the Shinkansen bullet train system. They've really never stopped building since that time. And they continue to open additional trunk and regional lines. And so this has been a long-term commitment on the part of that country to expanding their high-speed rail networks. And really that's the path that we would go down here. So we have the initial construction segment, which we could start on as early as next fall, and that would build up to 130 miles of this track in the Central Valley that Roelof was just discussing. I'll come back to that in a moment. That becomes the spine or the foundation for the high-speed rail system. After that, our next step is the one that we really ask you to focus on as the crucial step, and that is when we put the initial operating segment into being. Now, the initial operating segment could be one of two choices that the authority will make sometime over the next couple of years, and that is either to build the initial operating segment from the valley south to the gateway to Los Angeles, or from the valley north to the San Jose area and the gateway to the San Francisco Bay. It would either go from Bakersfield to San Jose, or it will go from Merced to somewhere in the San Fernando Valley. That initial operating segment would have an as-built cost, and we believe it could be done so that it's in service by 2021, assuming that funding is available. And that would have an as-built cost of roughly $30 billion. But it would bring high-speed rail to California, and it would bring high-speed rail to America, and it would serve millions and millions of people. And it would operate with a net operating profit, as Roelof was just describing. What that initial operating segment will do is trigger the build-out of the rest of the high-speed rail system, both by establishing ridership and also bringing in private investment to help build out further segments. After the initial operating segment, the next leg would then be to connect the San Francisco Bay Area with the Los Angeles Basin, and then we would push on in further to the city centers after that. Now, the numbers here are very large, and there's no question about that, but it's important to try to keep them in perspective. First of all, as I've said, we're talking about numbers here associated with a project to be built over the next 20 to 25 years. And very few infrastructure projects are presented to the public in that fashion, where we're really looking at what the entire build-out cost would be. Second, and crucially important, these are not all public dollars that we're talking about, because we do estimate that we will have a significant amount of private sector capital coming in. And let me also say, this would be a true public-private partnership, because there would be very active private sector participation throughout the life of this project. In the early years, the private sector will be involved in the design build of the first sections. In later years, the private sector will be involved in operation and maintenance of the system, similar to what's been done in Europe and Japan and elsewhere. Beyond that, we actually see the opportunity for true public-private partnerships where private dollars can come in for both the design, build, finance, construction, and operation of the system. So we have very robust plans for private sector involvement. And one of the things I want to say about that is, one of the aspects of the business plan as well is that we've tried to respond to critiques and criticisms that have come from a number of different quarters. One of those important voices that has been critical of some of the plans in the past has been from your own peer review committee that the legislature has established. And one of their primary concerns was that there was no fundamental business model for the high-speed rail authority. I think with this notion now that we're going to follow the path that's been laid out with other successful high-speed rail systems of public dollars providing the foundation and then private dollars coming in after that, is something that's both responsive to those concerns and a reasonable and effective way to go forward. Finally, I want to say that in keeping the large dollar numbers in perspective, we do talk in the report about the alternative costs. And for too long, high-speed rail has been viewed by some, I think, as a question of a luxury decision that we could make in California. Do we build this system or not? Wouldn't it be great to have these cool, fast trains running? But in fact, we would urge you in your capacity as decision makers to look at the broader question. With whatever population figures you use, and we use very conservative population growth figures, our state is going to be growing. I'm always amazed when I open up and see an editorial about how we're building a train to nowhere. The Central Valley of California has 4.2 million people in it, according to the 2010 census. That would put it ranked 26th among the 50 states of the United States. So serving that population serves more people than live in about half the states in the United States. It is anything but a place we could call nowhere. And I came onto this board as somewhat of a skeptic about the decision to start in the Central Valley, and I'd heard all these voices saying that's the wrong thing to do. In addition to the technical reasons that Mr. Van Ark gave you, I've come to believe that it's the right place to start for a couple of other reasons. One is that we get more track per dollar there than any other place that we would build. So we are able to use our initial dollars to secure as much track miles as we could. Secondly, precisely because, as Mr. Hartnett will talk about, we're looking now at this blended approach, It's the one area of the state where we really don't have an existing rail operation that we can integrate with and build on. And so acquiring that right-of-way is very, very important, and that right-of-way will have lasting value. So let me just end with this before I turn it over to Mr. Rossi. Jim Hartnett mentioned my service on the BART board. One of the things I learned in looking back at the history of BART, long before I ever was involved with it, was that the decision to build BART also was a very difficult public policy decision that had many of the attributes that this decision has. And people looked at that and they said, well, it's going to be expensive, technically can we do it, it has a lot of risk, et cetera, et cetera. As you know, several counties dropped out of that, and it came down to one vote by one county supervisor in Contra Costa in the 1960s. And that one person basically became the person who decided whether or not BART was going to be built for the Bay Area. Now, 50 years later, we look back on that decision, and it certainly has transformed both the way we live and has provided an economic engine. So these decisions are crucially important, and it's very hard to know, as Steve Jobs said, how to connect the dots looking forward, but we can connect them looking backwards. So with that, I'll stop at this point, turn it over to my colleagues, but we appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. Thank you.
We have 2 minutes left. I'll give you a minute each.
So I, you know.
That's the problem. I took my glasses off.
Yeah,
I wasn't
great.
watching.
Here's the deal. One of the other things that people talk all the time about is the model. And there are a whole series of things we can discuss with the model, but not in a minute. So I'm going to just leave you with this. I've spoken to the representatives of CARD, who I've been speaking to regularly and have great respect for. And this morning I spoke to Dr. Matanet of the Berkeley Institute, talking about his 4 slides and what his 2 issues were. He and I have agreed, and you can check, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the view is that his second point doesn't dramatically speak to the issue of the gross numbers for ridership. In the case of the first issue, we are dealing with that issue. We felt we have dealt with it in the model. The chairman of the peer review group, Dr. Koppelman, has said that as we work through the validation, we will be able to see exactly what that impact is by changing the theoretical approach to that issue. We will do that at the end of this next refinement cycle.
Louder.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry. And that we will work through those issues. But it is our belief that at the end of the day, they will not dramatically change the numbers. Having said that, however, I'll just point you to the one section of the ridership chapter and the revenue chapter that talks about break-even. If, in fact, you look at the break-even numbers for 2026, what you will find is that this model would have to be off 83% for us not to make our numbers on a break-even basis. That's pretty robust in the issue of how conservative those ridership numbers are. And the final thing I'd tell you about looking at population ridership ratios that Ruloff mentioned a while ago, if you look at the six countries that we have the data for, and you look at their population, ridership to population ratio, on average it's 1.8. When you take out the outliers, which is the highest and the lowest, it's 1.7. In 2030 for California high-speed rail, it's 1.05, and in 2040, it's 1.29, significantly below the international averages. There are a number of other things we could talk about, but I will cede the next 30 seconds to Jim.
Jim, a 30-second wrap-up.
The blended approach is embraced in the draft business plan. And it also compels, and the business plan points to early investment in both Southern California and on the peninsula to do 2 things. One is to support those systems in a way that is important to them and their communities, and 2, do that in a way that's consistent and supportive of ultimate implementation of the blended system. They're synergistic, they work together, the blended approach can work, and thank you for suggesting it.
All right, let me, before we dismiss the panel, Are there any questions from my colleagues? Mr. Valdeo?
I didn't get a whole lot of information out of this panel here as far as business plan, but one question I get a lot is, you're expecting $55 billion from the federal government over the lifetime of the project to come in. I've heard comments people are expecting or hoping that Obama wins a second term so we can continue with funding. Do you honestly believe that there's enough? I mean, we don't even have the support here in California. We've seen polling at 62% would kill it today. It's been called the boondoggle in D.C. Where do you expect to get the votes for $55 billion more, even if Obama does get a second term? He doesn't have control of one house, and will he have control of the second house? I mean, we're hinging a lot, breaking the ground next year on over 50% of what your numbers are $100 billion. This is over 50% of the cost of the project. Do you really expect us to believe that we're going to get $55 billion for this project?
Assembly member, very quickly on that. I mentioned that our focus is on the initial operating segment. The initial operating segment would cost about $30 to $33 billion. Of that, we have $3 billion of federal funds now. There's up to $9 billion of bond money. So we're relatively far
When you say
along.
$9 billion of bond money, that's only if you get matched from the feds, right?
That's correct, sir.
So you only have $6 billion total.
Right, but
Okay.
what I'm saying is we don't need to expect $55 billion from the feds.
You're expecting $13 billion in the next 10 years.
I'm saying that
No, that's
that
what
is
your
a more-
business plan says.
we
$13
say-
billion in the
that's
next
right.
10 years.
Yes.
We have to. Well, they're looking for almost over $1 trillion in cuts.
Right. Assemblyman, this comes back to the same question, which is if we don't do this, which is a policy choice that we could make, we will have to spend perhaps twice those amount of dollars for equivalent mobility facilities for people in California.
Will we be able to maintain the existing infrastructure and the new high-speed rail? Because we have roads to maintain. I'm sure you read the report last week or earlier this week that talked about how we don't have enough money to pay for the infrastructure we have now.
That's right. I did read that report, and it's very important. And if I were sitting in your place, I would be very concerned about that as well. So that's certainly true. But I do want to say that, again, if we get to the initial operating segment, it changes the dynamic because it brings in private dollars. It reduces the amount of any further federal money we need.
And that brings up an interesting point. The private dollars, we were told there was going to be private investment early on. I remember Mr. Van Ark in my office one day talking about people lining up to invest in this thing early on. And now the business plan comes out saying that we have to get the first part started for the private money to come in. Do we really expect the private money to come in?
Yes. Because what we're talking about, if we complete the iOS, you're looking at the sale of forward revenues, which are documentable, which is done all the time in this country and has been for years. We took it at an 8, 11, and 14% discount rate, which is unbelievably high.
We can't even sell the bonds. for
You
high-speed
asked
rail.
me whether or not I could sell the revenues. Yes, I can sell the revenues. You want to ask me about the bonds? I venture to guess we could sell the bonds. The state of California bonds happen to sell, buy a lot of them. But the point is, Assemblyman, you asked me a specific question, and I'm answering it. The fact is that the sale of future revenues is a standard business in this country in all capital markets. We took it at more than reasonable discount rates. So the answer to your question is yes, we believe we could sell those future streams on a 30-year concession.
Okay.
And after that 30 years, because these are 100-year assets, we could sell it again, and then we could sell it one more time after that.
And the reason I asked this question is because I was told in my office that we were going to have private investment early on, and we could expect to have that money here, and people were lining up to do this. And now the business plan has changed, and it's different in the book than what I was told.
Assembly member, I
And
will
why would I have
correct
faith
that.
in the system as is now?
Assembly member, I would like to correct it. I have said, and I will say again, the people that want to fund these projects do speak to us, and they still continue to speak to us, and I've said that before. I've also always said that you can only fund these projects, because that's my background, you can only fund these projects when you get close to the revenue stream. It's never been any different. That is fact. And this is exactly what the business plan is saying. When you get close to the revenue stream, that's when you can sell that revenue stream. You cannot get people in upfront without that promise that there's going to be a revenue stream. So the business plan is got exactly in here what we had discussed.
Jerry?
Rich, I'm sensitive to your time, and I don't want to, and Assemblyman Valadeo asked the questions that were of concern to me, and that is when that private funding would come into it, and what's determining, and Mr. Van Ark did answer that you have to have a revenue stream before, but I guess my concern is how do we, I mean, can we determine it, or is there a possibility to have that private funding before we make that large investment, the first phase of the construction segment and then the operating segment that would be necessary? And I think that's the gamble that the authority is asking the legislature and the state to take.
That's absolutely right. In this, can you hear me? I'm sorry. It would be highly unrealistic to suggest, and I can't speak for what you heard before. I wasn't here.
I speak a little more into it.
Is this better? I'm sorry, sir. It would be highly unrealistic to think that the capital markets would make any kind of commitment to the initial stages of a capital-intensive infrastructure project. We're looking at an investment predicated on the sale of future revenues. So you're going to, in order to do that, you're going to have a completed operating segment, the IOS, whether it's south or north. And that's when you can actually sell something. To tell you we could sell it before that, you're not going to get me to tell you that.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple of questions that I don't necessarily need answers today, but I would like answers. I'm particularly concerned about the initial construction segment, because it appears to me that there is a chance that that might be all the money we have for a short period of time before we can ever get to initial operating segment. What I want to understand, if we make the investment in the initial construction segment, what have we, I mean, it parallels an existing Amtrak line in the Central Valley. How many stations would be removed? Would there be an impact on service in the Central Valley if the ICS is built and essentially replaces the existing service? And I guess the final part of this, and in trying to understand kind of what that looks like, is that Mr. Van Ark, you said that you know, the initial segment would allow us to test high-speed rail. Does that mean that the ICS will be constructed as an electrified system, non-diesel, and actually have the capacity over, what, 130 miles to truly test the viability of high-speed rail? So if you could get back to me with those answers, I would certainly appreciate it. With that, let me suggest we have, if you're game, I've got room at the dais up here if you'd like to join us in case, during the course of the rest of this hearing, there are other issues or questions that come up that perhaps we want to turn to you for a response. If you don't want to sit up here, that's okay, but I'd invite you to do that. And as you move, let me invite forward the next two speakers, Farrah Brock and Will Kempton. I don't know whether Will has arrived yet. Is Will here? Great. This had been identified on the agenda for those who have it as a response panel. We have Farrah Brock, who is the managing principal analyst with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and Will Kempton, who is the chair of the High Speed Rail Peer Review Group. We welcome both of you. And I'm going to also listed on the agenda was Dr. Madnat, director of the Berkeley ITS. He notified us late yesterday that he would not be appearing here today. He was unable to attend. So we just have 2 folks on this panel, but keeping to the time that I had originally offered, we have 5 minutes for each of you. So Farah, if you would please start. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Farah Brocht with the Legislative Analyst's Office. With me, I have my colleague, Brian Weatherford. As you guys know, we are the office that provides nonpartisan advice to the legislature, particularly on issues related to the state's budget. I'm going to move fairly quickly through parts of my handout that is in your package, hopefully, and for those of you in the audience, it's on our website. The first part of our handout was just...
Farah, could I ask anyone who's speaking to move the microphone as close as possible so that the sound can be picked up clearly?
Is that better?
Better, thank you.
Okay. We have a brief background where we provide some information on the prior 2 business plans and note some of the information that we found lacking in those prior plans. On the next page of our handout, we move into the requirements that are in Proposition 1A for the specific elements in the 2012 business plan. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these either because you can read through them yourselves, and I'll move into some of our bigger issues. On the following page then, on the other piece of legislation that was passed was page 3, SB 783 by Senator Ashburn. This also provided some specific elements of what should be included in the 2012 business plan. Then moving on to page 5, your staff had asked us to provide a context for reviewing the business plan. So here on page 5, we introduced some high-level questions that we think each of you might want to consider as you review the business plan. The first would be, have each of the elements that were required in the previous legislation that I just mentioned been addressed in the business plan? And we are still in the process of reviewing those elements and reviewing the plan to determine if all of those criteria have been met. The second point is the plan credible? A business plan, as you know, is a marketing plan that intends to raise capital for the project. And in this case, the capital is going to be coming from the state, it's going to come from the federal government, and ideally it will be coming from private investors down the road. So you're going to be wanting to ask questions if the business document is internally consistent. Do the numbers hold together? Does it make sense? Then the final high-level question we think you should be asking yourselves is, does the plan provide a high enough level of confidence to proceed with the project? As you know, risk is a natural part of any large project, and the potential benefits to society should be commensurate with the level of risk. Thus, the plan needs to provide a sufficient amount of information to allow for confidently weighing the potential risk versus the potential benefits. As you move to page 6, here we are providing some of our initial review, our thoughts. We have identified many issues that we think do merit legislative consideration. We are in the process of asking high-speed rail additional questions. We've sent over a long list of questions. We're also in the process of setting up meetings with them to get a better understanding of a lot of the issues that are raised in the business plan. It's possible that some of these issues will be resolved as we have further conversations with them. It may also be that further issues are brought to our attention. Overall, we think it's essential for the legislature to have adequate information in order to make decisions about whether or not to proceed with this project. The first point we make is one that I think you have touched on in some of your initial questions, is we do have concerns with the funding that's been identified. As you know, the funding that's available right now would only complete the initial construction segment. That leaves a lot of questions about where the funding would come to complete the rest of the project. This is also similar to issues that we raised in our May report that we released this year. We were very concerned about where the funding for the project would come. We also have done some looking at the economic impact analysis that is in the report. It appears to be imbalanced. One of the challenges of this is this means that it could potentially portray the project as more favorable than it may warrant. For example, some jobs and economic activity will likely be lost as some businesses in the right-of-way are impacted by construction. That would be a negative impact. In addition, while the project may relieve some highway congestion, it may also create more urban congestion in some areas where there are stations and people are traveling to the stations. We don't know that that has been fairly considered and weighed in the economic impact analysis. On page 7, This was also mentioned. We don't think there are an adequate number of details provided about the initial construction segment. If this is all that ever gets built, we think you definitely need to have more information to decide if this is the appropriate place to invest the state dollars. We have some questions. We think it would be important to provide complete information about capital costs, operating and maintenance costs, the cost of connecting to Amtrak, and an estimate of the net benefits to the state from the construction of this segment. This would help you to evaluate the benefit to the state if that is all that is ever constructed. It's also unclear if the business plan satisfies the requirements in Proposition 1A. We mentioned the funding being available. Proposition 1A appears to require funding being available for a usable segment. We're not sure if it meets that test. There's also a question if the blended approach would also meet the speed and travel time requirements that are in Proposition 1A. So those are other areas that are certainly worth looking into further. On the next point, we have concerns about the cost comparisons that were made between the high-speed rail, the cost of the full project, and then the cost of building out an equivalent amount of capacity. The comparison, we believe, is problematic because it compares the theoretical maximum capacity of high-speed rail with building an equivalent capacity of roads and airports. From our initial review, it appears that this ignores existing capacity, it ignores future demands for travel throughout the state, and it ignores the potential benefits from using travel demand management tools that could actually do a lot to improve the use of our existing system.
In consideration of time, we need to have you wrap up.
My last point is one we've raised earlier. We have concerns about the staffing levels being adequate at high-speed rail to bring this project through. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that you've had about 2 weeks to look at this. I think what you've done is identified, as I hope much of this hearing will do, additional questions and issues that we need to consider and discuss over the next several months. So thank you. And Will Kempton, the peer review group, has only had a couple of weeks to look at this also, so welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. There, thank you. I'm Will Kempton. I'm Chief Executive Officer of the Orange County Transportation Authority, but I'm here today in my capacity as Chair of the peer review group created by Chapter 267 of the Statutes of 2008. We are, as you have indicated, Mr. Chairman, still reviewing the document. We haven't had a chance to formulate any specific recommendations yet, but I think I can make some general statements which will hopefully be helpful to your membership. I will say, and I believe that this will be supported by the other members of the peer review group, that the plan is a substantial improvement over previous plans that have been produced by the High-Speed Rail Authority. And I think one of the things that is most heartening, and this goes beyond my position as chair of the peer review group, but also as a head of a transportation agency along the corridor, the blended approach which the business plan embraces is something that is welcome news. We have long sought that approach. We think it's a reasonable approach to proceeding in a way that will allow high-speed rail to be implemented segmentally or incrementally into the future. I would say also that I think the plan does lay out a reasonably logical sequencing approach, and I think it makes a very good case for segmental construction. As the plan cites, the interstate system was not built in a single fell swoop. It was built segmentally, piece by piece, and any major project is going to require that approach, particularly one with this expense. There is an identification which was previously lacking as to when private sector funding would be available. Whether or not that comes to pass is, of course, open to question, but at least there is a plan to say when private sector dollars would come into play. It does call for early investment in other segments of the system. We think that's a good thing, and particularly, again, in those areas on the blended segment. However, there still are problems that I'm sure the peer review group will call to the attention of the legislature. I think we're concerned about the schedule delay. We understand the reasoning for it, but it is still problematic. As you move a project, particularly of this magnitude, out farther, it's more expensive. The cost increase is, of course, quite dramatic, and I appreciate the fact that this business plan appears to take a very sober look at the costs, and that is positive in that sense, but it is a large amount of money. And I think probably the biggest concern that we will have is that the plan does not identify funding to complete either one of the initial operating segments, and those have a cost of about 20 to 30 billion, as I recall, in the business plan. And there are some sources of funding identified, but those sources are by no means assured, and that's a significant cost to be in place before the operation starts returning money. We will want to look carefully at ridership and revenue projections. We also will want to, as the analyst has indicated, be looking at risk identification and mitigation and some of the operating assumptions that have been made. And finally, it is very clear that staffing is still a problem for the High-Speed Rail Authority. That is not a problem that has been generated by the authority, but that issue needs to be addressed if this project is going to proceed. Mr. Chairman, that's just a brief overview and summary of some of the things I think we'll be looking at as we conduct our review.
Thank you. Let me ask my colleagues if there are questions of either of these two presenters.
Quick question, Mr. Kempton. As far as the peer review group, how many people sit on this group?
The peer review group, Assemblymember Valadeo is, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Valadeo, thank you. The peer review group consists of 8 members. 6 of those positions are filled. There's still 2 vacancies.
Who picks these people?
It's a combination of the governor, the Department of Finance, the Secretary of Business Transportation and Housing, as well as the controller and the treasurer.
And all these people are completely separate, independent. None of them have any gain, any financial gain from the project itself?
That's correct. There's no financial conflict of interest associated with our members. None of them are working for consultants or others that are engaged in the project.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thanks, Rich. Ms. Brock, the strategy that you've outlined, I think, is excellent, and I think that'll give us many of the answers that we're looking for. What is the time frame for this?
That we're doing our further look into that? Right now, we're trying to get through this as quickly as possible and get the meetings set up with High-Speed Rail and their consultants so that we can understand these things. We don't have a time frame at this point for a report, but hopefully in the next month and a half, we'll get something out. Yeah.
Very good. That's close enough. Thank you.
Okay. And the timeline for the now, I guess, the draft becoming final, Dan, what's the timeline on that?
Mr. Chairman, it's nominally 60 days. We're in discussions with various legislative offices because the 60 days would truncate the public comment period because of the holidays. But we're prepared to meet that 60-day time frame. We're also prepared to go a couple weeks beyond that if it's the combined judgment of the legislature and the authority that this would be beneficial to public comment. But we'll respect the statutory deadlines.
Okay. So that's the time frame within which we're hoping to hear back from you also. Good. All right. Thank you very much. We'll move now. I'm going to, we listed this, identified this as 2 separate panels. I'm just going to invite the next 6 people to all come up at once, and we'll go through this. That would be Jim Wunderman, Cesar Diaz, William Grindley, Daniel Kraus, Elizabeth Alexis, and Aaron Fukuda. All right, I'm going to keep to the same time limits, so everyone gets 5 minutes, and I'll be rudely cutting you off. No, I'll try to be polite about cutting you off. And so let me start the way this was listed on the agenda. We'll do it that way rather than the way you're necessarily seated. And we'll start with Jim Wunderman. Jim is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Bay Area Council. And again, I would remind you to speak closely into the microphone.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Gordon, members of the Budget Subcommittee. I'm Jim Wunderman, President and CEO of the Bay Area Council. I appreciate having the opportunity to testify today on the updated California High-Speed Rail business plan. As the previous speakers have aptly described, the updated business plan presents a blunt yet very honest assessment of the many financial and operational challenges confronting high-speed rail. And make no mistake, as has been pointed out, there are many challenges and many questions will have to be answered. But the updated business plan takes on those questions directly and honestly and lays out what we believe is a realistic, responsible, and sensible framework for making high-speed rail a reality in California. I don't think that there's anyone here, and certainly not me, has ever been under the false impression that creating a workable and successful high-speed rail system in a place as geographically and politically complex and diverse as California was ever going to be an easy thing or an expensive thing. I guess some might characterize high-speed rail as something of a dream. I disagree with that. I believe that high-speed rail is an absolute necessity for the state of California. For decades, California has failed to invest adequately in its infrastructure to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, probably hundreds of billions of dollars, whether it's in transportation or in education or energy or water, almost in every category. And yet, during that time, neither the need nor the cost of the challenge of maintaining and expanding our infrastructure has gotten any less expensive or easier to do. Quite the opposite, in fact. By not investing adequately in these things, we've ignored the fundamental question about how we exactly plan to grow our economy, manage our increasing population, protect our environment, and remain competitive in an ever-expanding global marketplace. And we all can be assured that nobody's going to be waiting for California or America to catch up. The alternatives for achieving the same level of transportation capacity that high-speed rail will deliver, building new freeways, bigger airports, are far more expensive, $170 billion by some estimates, and will be far more difficult than even high-speed rail is. They're also quite inconsistent with California's goals for battling climate change. All of these are really serious questions for California, and especially for the peninsula, which is not immune to the effects of growth and our systemic lack of investment in infrastructure. Everyone who is working hard right now to bring Caltrain into the future here should well understand that. Through the blended approach that invests in upgrading Caltrain as a preliminary step to bringing high-speed rail to the Bay Area, we can begin to make progress on modernizing and expanding the capacity of this outdated commuter rail system to better manage our own growth and support a growing economy. We should also remember the 100,000 jobs that high-speed rail will bring to the Bay Area during its construction and the hundreds of thousands more jobs it will create throughout the state of California during its lifetime. Does this updated business plan answer all the questions and concerns that exist here or in the Central Valley and elsewhere about how exactly we can possibly accomplish this obviously massive undertaking? Does it mean we shouldn't continue to engage the public or address those questions and concerns? Of course not. But the business plan is also not a static document. Just as any business plan must undergo continuous change, critique, and evaluation as the circumstances around it change. That's the process that we're correctly following and will continue to follow under your leadership, Governor Brown's leadership, and the leadership of the California High-Speed Rail Authority. As a policy organization, the Bay Area Council is focused on the future and asking the bigger and often very difficult questions about what it might look like and how we get there. As a business organization, we're also focused on making sure that we're investing wisely and responsibly and that there will be a return on our investments. We believe high-speed rail is consistent with the vision for how we will grow and connect California, and the updated business plan provides the first section of track for doing just that. Thank you again, Chairman Gordon and members of the committee, for the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you.